In the mid-70s, Argentina was chaotic. In 1976, following a series of uprisings, the military staged a coup and ousted Isabel Perón. Army General Jorge Videla became de facto president.
The takeover that took place in March of '76 by the Argentine military was really seen by most Argentines as a relief from the chaos left by the Peronist regime. Perón had died. His wife, whose principal advisor was an astrologer, was running the country into the ground.
The military came in, and to begin with, everybody thought that everything would be okay. The military would do what they'd done in the past, is sort of paint things nicely and get things running again and call elections, and then democracy would return. And hopefully it would be better this time. But of course, this time the military came in with an agenda, and the agenda really was to wipe out the left.
Lo que ocurrió aquí.
What happened here was a consequence of the revolutionary process that was poured on Latin America and was directed by the government of Fidel Castro in Cuba. The role of the military in the 70s was to preserve the Constitution, to preserve the electoral majority decision, because it was the constitutional government that ordered the armed forces to suppress terrorism.
No solamente en la Argentina, sino en toda Latinoamérica.
Not only in Argentina, but in all Latin America, a guerrilla movement had begun, supported by countries like Russia, Cuba, and others. In 1970, the violence was so bad that in Congress, both representatives and senators asked that a problem they couldn't solve by themselves be taken care of. The Democratic government of the time granted the military forces the power to intervene and annihilate the guerrillas in all of the country.
O sea, delitos cometidos desde el Estado son delitos que no se pueden.
Crimes committed by the state cannot be compared to any other actions or procedures. They are not comparable to the actions of the revolutionary organizations or guerrillas that operated during this historical period. The state that uses all its institutions to repress its citizens and commit crimes cannot be compared to any other proceedings.
The problem in Argentina was that once you start the killing machine, the forces continue moving, and they just go after softer and softer targets. They saw themselves strategically involved in what they called World War III, which was a fight between global communism and Christian Western civilization. It was not only terrorism, which is putting a bomb or shooting someone or other act of violence or planning act of violence, but it was also a question of eradicating wrong thinking.
And one of the forms of destruction which they felt justified and which were tolerated for a while was essentially the mass arrest and disappearing of people who, in the instance of most of them, were simply, unfortunately, Jews, or unfortunately dissident voices, unfortunately almost anything except the hard left killer types. It's just that they couldn't stop. It was like the tapeworm. It started eating, and the next thing you knew, they were devouring everything that seemed to be even loosely subversive. And incidentally, subversive is their word.
Of the estimated 30,000 people kidnapped, tortured, and murdered, some 500 were new mothers or women who gave birth in the detention centers. Las Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, or the grandmothers of May Plaza, have been looking for those lost grandchildren ever since.
Las Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo son el resultado.
The Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo are the result and the answer to one of the most sinister methodologies implemented by the military dictatorship in Argentina, which was the kidnapping of babies. Besides the forced disappearance of people, that is the massive kidnapping of demonstrators. They would take possession of their children, in some cases of babies that had already been born, and in other cases of mothers who were pregnant, who had their babies in captivity. And these babies remained in the hands of military personnel or with families linked to the military forces.
My dad worked in the state telephone company. The military went directly to where he worked, and they captured him when he went out. After that, they went to the house in which he lived with my mom, and they captured her too. When I was born, I stayed with my mom for only 20 days. Then I was given to another family. There are no traces of my mom, the same as every pregnant woman and most of the people who went through that detention center. She's disappeared, the same as my dad. They would wait there for them to have their babies. In this case, they waited for my mom to have me, so we could be given to military families who would steal our identities from us and who tried to delete any traces so our biological families couldn't find us. I was raised with a family involved with state terrorism, a family where the man who said he was my father, my fake father, was a member of the intelligence service of the federal police. During those 26 years in which I lived with a false identity, I had many uncertainties, emotional instabilities, and at some point, I started to try and figure out why I was so anguished, so depressed, so emotionally unstable. So then I started to ask myself if I was or wasn't a child of these people. Plus, I knew this man's involvement in state terrorism, and during my youth, I began to have access to books and knowledge about how the state terrorism had worked during those years. Then I started to think that I might be the child of one of the disappeared. I had to take a DNA analysis. I got the test, and after 6 months of comparing my genetic results with those of people who were looking for family, grandparents who were looking for their grandchildren, in March 2004, I had proof that I wasn't part of this family, that I was the son of 2 disappeared people, and that my family was looking for me, that my grandparents were looking for me. The right to identity is a right everybody has. We all have the need to know who our parents are, what our name is, and to be raised and developed with our parents. Therefore, to know our identity is a step toward truth and accomplishing those rights. Ultimately, if I hadn't found the truth, I would still be in a sea of doubt, of uncertainty. So it was an extra happy moment to know my origins, the triumph of truth, and to meet my family.
Estela de Carlotto has been part of the grandmothers of May Plaza since 1978. She believes her daughter, Laura, died in a prison camp the previous year. De Carlotto immediately began searching for the son Laura had in captivity.
Las abuelas.
The grandmothers adopted the form of a very quiet, very respectful search because we were looking for little ones, children. Then we didn't know where they were. The task was a detective's task, a search for facts to see where they were.
They weren't anything else but housewives, accustomed to working at home and taking care of their families. They had to convert into promoters of peace, promoters of democracy.
Families sympathetic to the military took their grandchildren and changed everything about their identities.
El robo de bebés. Un delito grave.
Stealing babies is a crime, a grave crime of humanity. Time doesn't solve it. It affects not only that person, but their biological parents and society.
Every time a grandchild is found, it reinvigorates all the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo.
Para la abuela es un momento de una emoción tremenda.
For the grandma, it's a moment with tremendous excitement because she's found what she's been looking for so many years. And furthermore, they look like her son or daughter. The response of the child is of pain, shock, when they find out that their father and mother were not their real parents, that they had other parents, that they had another grandmother looking for them. There are some grandmas that are 90 years old. Some of us are younger. Some have died, others are sick. The day there is not one single grandma, this institution will be in the hands of the grandchildren.
Everything started with Oscar's, my father, disappearance in 1976. A few months later, my mother disappeared too. My sister and I witnessed her kidnapping in a park. Military men, dressed in green, came toward us while my mother hugged us, like she was saying goodbye. I didn't understand why. She tried to protect us by walking away from us while they chased her, so they wouldn't see us, because if not, we would all have been kidnapped. From there on, our lives changed. We were supposedly abandoned in the streets. That's why the court intervened and sent us to an orphanage, because we didn't have a family. I say this ironically because we did have a family, but they were kidnapped. I was 3.5 years old at the time, and my sister was a little baby.
Charles and Agnes Sefiligoy arranged to adopt Tatiana's sister.
My mother asked who I was, and an employee told her, "Don't say anything, but that's your baby's sister." My mom stared at her and said, "What? She has a sister?" It was a strange situation. Well, she said, "Both girls are coming home. They're sisters." Eventually, the story of us being found in a park did not convince my mother. She thought it was strange. She asked the judge 3 times if we didn't have a family, what happened to our parents. 3 times the judge answered, "Ma'am, these girls do not have a family. Stop asking." So she took this and never asked again until the Abuelas appeared in 1980, claiming they were looking for me. So they went to court with a picture and proved that it was us. Not a long time had passed, so we looked the same. Both families got to know each other and realized that there was no intention of hiding my story or lying to me. We weren't some war prize. We weren't being disputed, someone to be fought for.
Because of what she experienced, Tatiana decided to study psychology.
That is when they called me and said, "Well, Tati, let's see if you can give us a hand, because you have to know how to deal with kids who aren't kids anymore. They are teenagers, they are young men who have doubts, and we don't know how to help them psychologically." The son of Abel Madariaga, grandchild 101, said, "It took me 10 years to go to Abuelas." With that, he was preparing for that moment. It was a crisis he saw coming. He knew there was going to be an abrupt change, that there were going to be new things, that there was going to be a new family. They find out as grown-ups that they're not children from the people who raised them, who told them they were their parents. And right there, the trust you had for years in these people is broken. They were lied to. They were told they were their parents. Afterward, for that person to trust somebody is so hard. Your goal is to try to understand where you come from, and there are people who don't get this. They say, "That's the past. You need to forget about it. You need a clean slate." There are people that still think that everyone should forget about it, but we can't forget about it because it's not resolved.
Following a return to democracy and the healing only time can bring, much has changed for her and others affiliated with Las Abuelas. At the country's bicentennial celebration, a booth set up by the Abuelas attracted thousands of visitors, openly interested in the group's work.
If we go back to the beginning of our fight, nobody knew us and they rejected us. They didn't comprehend. They didn't understand and they were afraid. Today, there is no fear.
15 years ago, to say you were from Abuelas or Madres was socially like, oh no, it's better if you don't say that, just in case. Nowadays, you can say you were from that institution and nothing on the contrary. Sometimes they say, that's good, and what can I do to help them?
Some claim the military leaders at the time of the Dirty War were upright and humane and cannot be held responsible for the excesses of a few rogue elements of the armed forces.
The persecution of militants, the kidnapping of a generation, the appropriation of their children, and even the kidnapping of those who looked for them, because mothers of May Plaza who were looking for their children or family members of missing people also disappeared. Having all this in mind, one realizes it wasn't about sporadic excesses, but rather that it was all part of a systematic plan.
Where could we go to report? To the judicial power that was totally dominated by the government? To the policemen, who did nothing to stop the illegal forces of the state from kidnapping and killing us? We didn't know what to do.
Most of the time, there was silence. And for convenience, questions weren't asked.
Everyone knew someone who had been abducted, either in the neighborhood or a friend of a friend or a friend's relative, but you wouldn't talk about it.
The father would always be concerned about, look, you're making a lot of fuss, maybe he'll come back, maybe they'll let him go. I have to keep my job. We have other children. If we make a lot of noise about this child that's been taken away from us, maybe they'll come and take our other children as well.
If you look at the numbers, there were a few hundred military and police officials who were killed, and there were 13 to 30,000 people killed on the other side. That isn't a war, that's a slaughter.
There were war crimes committed by both sides. What is quite clear, however, is that there is no possible justification for what the military did. There was the knock on the door at 3 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes the door was just knocked down or blown down with a bomb, and people were taken off and they stole and they robbed and they raped.
Many of the prisoners wound up in the Navy Mechanics School, known across Argentina as ESMA.
During this military period, 5,000 young people were here. Their average age was less than 25 years old. Fewer than 200 survived the torture and assassinations committed here.
To do that terrible things to other human beings is necessary to deprive them of their human condition. They treated their prisoners as subhumans, not even as animals, because they were more compassive with animals than they were with their prisoners.
And worst of all, according to those involved in the human rights community, members of the military stole the babies of their enemies.
Dad and Mommy were tortured and killed, and the baby was given in a fake adoption to a colonel of the army.
Even with an external enemy, if you read the Geneva Conventions or the International Humanitarian Law from the Red Cross, nothing authorizes someone to steal children away.
There was no systematic theft of babies. There were only 10 cases, maybe 11, of people who kept the babies because they saw them homeless after a fight. In such cases, it was an act of love.
When they couldn't find somebody to take care of those children, they handed them over to some known family which they knew could take good care of them. So they intended to protect these children, not kidnap them.
Some of the appropriators tried to present their behavior, saying they saved these kids from abandonment, when the reality is most of them are responsible for the deaths of these kids' parents.
Victoria Donda, found grandchild number 78, bristles at two charges made by those who still support the former government. First, that the grandmothers and their supporters rigged the DNA results. And second, that the majority of the found grandchildren are actors paid to claim their children of the disappeared.
Ridículo. Eso, ridículo.
Ridiculous. It's ridiculous to argue with these people. It's as if I tried to have a conversation with someone who denies the Holocaust. You can't discuss things with these people. These people justify the most outrageous horrors of history.
As international media outlets began to pick up the story of the mothers and the grandmothers, three people not native to the country emerged as critical players in the struggle. Buenos Aires Herald editor Bob Cox, U.S. Embassy officer Tex Harris, and Assistant Human Rights Secretary for the Carter administration Pat Darien. Cox and his family eventually had to flee the country when continued threats convinced him of the military's plans for Argentina.
Taking it over and redoctrinating the country according to their extreme right-wing views, ultra-Catholic, intolerant, and after all, completely inhuman.
I was the reporter on the ground as a diplomat, sending back information to Washington on the human rights abuses that were taking place throughout Argentina. Over a period of time, we had a kind of temperature chart of the operational capacity of the Argentine clandestine program, which I then reported to Washington. Previous to this, what countries did internally was no one's business but their own. It was not the business of diplomacy. So the efforts that were begun during the Carter administration, spearheaded by Pat Darien, really changed the fabric and the texture of the practice of diplomacy as we know it today.
She was the first person from the outside world of the United States who came in and said to government and to everybody else that what was going on in the dirty war was unacceptable, that it violated national and international norms, and that the United States no longer felt that to be a tolerable exercise of power by the junta.
That message was decidedly different from the approach of the previous Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, who watched the 1978 World Cup in Buenos Aires with junta leader Jorge Videla.
They had been assured by a number of people in the American government that they were doing what America wanted them to do, crushing these left-wingers, crushing the possibility of commies taking over.
Martin Anderson first reported about Kissinger having given the green light to generals in this 1987 article in The Nation. Carlos Osorio at the National Security Archive in Washington, with help from students from the College of William and Mary, has uncovered a number of documents indicating the U.S. government, prior to the Carter administration, winked at what the regime was doing.
Henry Kissinger, in dealing with governments before he dealt with them, knew what it was that our intelligence services knew. Our intelligence services knew to the last drop of a sparrow what the Argentinian regime was doing.
And so did Pat Darien. She recalls the attempts at intimidation from the Argentina military.
He said, you better be careful. This is dangerous. And I said, well, of course it is, and you don't know how dangerous it is for you.
Sometimes I think the ones who were most outraged by her were not foreigners, but people within our own government.
One or two of my sort of counterparts in other parts of the government called me. I said, don't call me again. Leave me alone. I'm doing my job. Plain.
That job was to let dictators and despots know about a change in what had been U.S. policy.
Nations who are shoulder to shoulder with the United States are our friends in the fight against godless communism, even if they repress their own citizens.
To a new and decided emphasis on human rights, starting in Argentina with Las Madres, Las Abuelas, and hundreds of missing grandchildren.
A los 29 años.
Imagine meeting with your biological father and brother when you're 29. In my case, I lived all my life as an only child, all that time, those 29 years as an only child.
Si te van a decir la verdad.
If the truth means that you're going to be poorer than before, or you have to resign some things, maybe it hurts, or that something happens to your child or someone you love, there are some realities that do hurt. But I think that it's in this context I prefer the truth rather than not having it. And although it's something that generates sadness, anger, and different feelings, I prefer this reality to the one they made me believe.
His mother Hilda gave birth to Pedro in a detention center. Pedro's biological father, Jorge Nadal, spent 5 years in jail, 4 more in exile, and 30 years looking for Pedro.
I dedicated time every day to him, thinking about him and looking for him as if he were alive until the day we found him. It was magnificent. The place where we had our first contact was at his workplace. I pretended to be a mailman. I saw him and said, "Hello, I have this letter, and the company told me to give it to you by hand." He was a little surprised by this because it's not normal, but it gave me a moment to see him face to face. It allowed me to see that it was him. He looked similar to his brother and anthropologically had very similar features. I was sure it was him. I said, "Thank you very much," and left.
Pedro was 29 at the time. The DNA tests confirm he is the son of Jorge and Hilda.
I met with my biological family, and at that time I learned about my disappeared mother. I didn't realize until that moment that I could never meet her or have her with me, and never see the grandparents who had died. Sadly, in this case, in my case, my maternal grandmother died a few days, 15 or 20 days, before the DNA came back positive.
Pedro had to deal with that sadness and a range of reactions from 2 groups of people.
Within the immediate social group, friends, family, and others, there is a division. There are those who say, "I see what you have been through, and I accompany you." I don't know if they understand you, but at least they accompany you. And there are many others that think you have to be grateful because your appropriators rescued you, or they really did you a favor.
Pedro and his dad just want to make up for all of the years apart.
To recover the time lost, well, I don't think it's possible to recover it, so I propose that I should live many, many more years.
Argentine society has been trying to deal with the horrors of the dirty war for nearly 4 decades. Leon Arslanian was one of the judges who heard charges against the military and condemned the brutal methods of the regime.
Las mujeres jóvenes.
When young pregnant women had their babies in captivity, their babies were not given to their grandparents nor to other family members, but rather were handed to members of the security forces, to policemen or military men who adopted them. And this was a methodology that was repeated in each and every one of these cases.
So they wanted to give them good families, Christian military families. These children were treated as war booty.
El Estado está para protegernos.
The state exists to protect us and to guarantee that laws are applied, not to commit criminal acts.
The grandmothers of the missing babies continue to suffer because of those crimes.
Son las víctimas de
They are the victims of the spoils of war, which were their grandchildren. Their sons or daughters were kept alive in captivity until they had their babies. And then the babies were taken and their mothers were assassinated, along with their fathers.
Some accuse the Abuelas and others of selective memory.
esconden la condición de guerrillero de sus hijos.
They hide the fact that their sons and daughters were guerrilla members who attacked the government, trying to take it over, to take the government and rule it with a Marxist system, as in Cuba and Russia of that time.
You could somehow argue, and lots of people did, that their children were terrorists, their children were guerrilla fighters. They had in turn, put bombs, in military headquarters or killed lots of people. In the case of the babies, there is no way you could say that they were guilty of absolutely anything.
While at the BA Herald, Gonyi researched the Nazi influence on the dictatorship and says the military had a clear goal in mind when it came to the appropriated children.
The most sublime victory for them would be to turn over to their kind of thinking the children, the captured children of the godless terrorists whom they were fighting against.
Un bebé no es enemigo, es un bebé.
A baby isn't an enemy, it's a baby. But they stole them. It was done to instill fear for many generations and to demonstrate the power they had over the life of their victim. They tortured, raped, they stole their rights, and they robbed even to taking their kids.
The mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters of people who were disappeared, they, after a time, after a decade, realize that their son or daughter is not coming back. But the grandmothers know that their grandchildren are alive.
The grandmothers of May Plaza refused to be victims, and human rights groups around the world joined the fight.
Principally because of the cultural cries from the mothers and the grandmothers who were missing their children and their grandchildren. And that was a cry that was heard and understood around the world.
We were driving as usual, and he suddenly stopped. When he stopped the van to tell me all of this, the first thing he did was burst into tears, and then it was as if he switched places, and a whole other person was in front of me. And he said, "No, you're not my biological son. You're adopted. And on top of that, you're the son of a disappeared person."
De no tener nunca una duda de ser hijo adoptado.
And I went from not ever having doubts of being adopted, from not ever feeling different from my family, to being told all of this. I was shocked.
Al estar yo muy cerca en ese entonces con mi apropiado.
Since I was very close back then with my appropriators, it was really difficult for me to get together with my family. I had to go through an entire process to detach from the other family. I had to wait for a trial determination to be able to say, okay, this is it for me. I won't be with you people anymore. And no, it wasn't nice at all. And when the trial came to an end, that's when everyone showed their real colors and started telling me, okay, you are the one to blame here. This is your fault. And right there, the truth was disclosed. The truth about who they really are. And every chance of maintaining a relationship with them back then disappeared.
One revelation was especially troubling.
Hace 6 meses atrás de
6 months before I was born, they had already selected me. The selection was based on my mother's features, which are the same as the ones of the woman that raised me, my appropriator. They're both French descent, blonde, slim, tall. Matching the features, the selection was all on Ray, and everything fitted together for me to be their son. There were no loose strings.
Alejandro has cut all ties with the people he now calls his appropriators and has built tight bonds with his biological family. His uncle Edgardo first met Alejandro in 2006.
At that time, you do not know what to do. You can only embrace, touch, but do not know what to say, because you want to resolve 30 years there in 30 seconds. But in fact, 30 years is resolved in 30 years. I always said to my children that you have like a brother, and one day I'm going to find him. You have to be fully confident that we will succeed. And we did. It cost a lot of time, a lot of pain, but he is here now and he is free. That's the most important thing, isn't it?
But there was more.
It was also about my sister, who had conquered death and defeated her torturers and rapists, the people who murdered her. And it was a moment of a lot of happiness, a lot of hope.
Alejandro has also gotten to know his grandmother, Clelia Fontana, a member of Las Abuelas.
I have done many things to try to find him. I have traveled to so many places to find news about his whereabouts. We knew that she had a child. When she was in the concentration camp, in the athletic camp, she continued her pregnancy, and she had a baby boy. And we always followed this information, searching for him. Then the judge called us to say that there was a boy, a man really, who was possibly our grandchild. We met each other at the court. It seemed like we were seeing his parents again. He was so similar to my son, to his uncle. It couldn't be denied. It was a very wonderful happiness. Even though I found my grandson, I kept going with the grandmothers to help them find the grandchildren that are still missing. It is something like my daughter is saying, "Continue, Mama. Continue, Mama. Keep going. I cannot stop going."
Even after the return of democracy, some in Argentina continued to deny that kidnappings, torture, murder, and stealing babies ever took place on a systematic basis. Then former Navy officer Adolfo Shilingo admitted that he took part in death flights. And threw drug prisoners out of airplanes into the ocean.
The confession of Captain Shilingo had that strong impact in Argentine society. For the first time, one of the military responsible for the crimes admitted to have committed crimes. And then, from this moment on, there was no more two versions of history.
In 2005, a Spanish court convicted Shilingo of crimes against humanity. Other former members of the military were hiding in plain sight.
Once the dictatorship collapsed, they all started living perfectly normal, law-abiding lives. So what you see is that what's evil actually is the system. If a system is put in place that promotes or allows or condones these kind of crimes, then the crimes happen.
And the people who committed those crimes in the name of protecting the country were continuing to deny any wrongdoing.
They will, at end of day, simply say, every bit of evidence out there is a plant. Every bit of information that you've heard is a fake. The science is phony science. The people who cry on cue are actors. And you look there and say, who else believes that?
Nearly 4 decades after the fall of the military regime, Argentines continue to struggle with what happened and with the concept of reconciliation.
reconciliation is a religious concept. It's not a juridical concept. The perpetrator must be repentant for what he or she has done.
How can someone forgive the other when there's still no justice that imparts some kind of penalty or punishment for what has been done?
I could not forgive the person who threw my mother alive from an airplane. Could you forgive someone who threw your mother alive from an airplane? I don't know if it's something that can be forgiven. The only thing I'm interested in is that there is justice.
If things aren't in their place, we cannot continue walking through the street, victims and victimizers, because they're not repentant. They have never demonstrated remorse or stated their regret for what happened.
No demuestran ningún sentimiento.
They don't demonstrate any feelings. They don't repent. They don't confess. And more, they are convinced that they have saved the country. A person who can torture, who can make another suffer and feel fine, is not a human being.
What made the millions of collaborators of the Nazi regime put in practice a massacre of those dimensions? How can an apparently normal person with a family who lives like a normal citizen somehow be a merciless torturer too?
Because there are no definitive answers to those questions, groups such as Amnesty International must continue to fight.
I would love to have to close the door, to say this world doesn't need Amnesty International anymore. Sadly, I think we're very far from that. It's a very long road and there's still lots to do. But I dream of the day it comes true.
Until it does, they will all work to preserve one of the most basic human rights.
After the right to life, which is the principal human right, the right to identity is the next one. Because if people don't know who they are, they can't develop their lives fully. I believe the right to identity is essential to being human.
And it's the single-mindedness of their dedication to that right that earned the Abuelas UNESCO's 2011 Félix Boigny Peace Prize.
In terms of what they've done against enormous difficulties and odds, and what they've created, is just remarkable.
They're a monument to what you think of as the possibilities and the responsibilities and the rights of free people. To petition for the redress of grievance over and over and over again.
Some say if there is no justice, there can be no peace. But to know justice is to know peace. The fight isn't over, but a former Argentine military officer says if you win the minds of the people, you've won the war. He concedes that the Abuelas have won the minds of the people.